Well, last week we picked on the elders a little bit, so this week we're going to pick on you deacons a little bit. How about that? Can we do that? Deacons are, I would say, the unsung heroes of local churches. As a matter of fact, I dare say that often you could probably walk into local congregations and ask this is embarrassing, but you could ask members, just anybody, well, who are your deacons? And you probably, at first, you might go, and have to think about it a second. Those of you who serve as deacons, you don't typically get the notoriety or the recognition that the elders do. And I will say that there's some reason for that, as we'll talk about as we go through some of the text, but I also think that it's a shame in a lot of ways too that we don't more openly and honorably maybe recognize the work of deacons. When we're talking about the church and its makeup and its nature and what the church is, which is what we've been doing now through this whole series of lessons, the leadership in the Lord's church and the offices or the works within the church are very important to take a look at. And this is one of those things that men have messed up over the history of the church. And you'll see, if you just look in the world around us, all variations and all kinds of differences when it comes to the structure of the leadership and the offices within the church. The interesting thing about that is the Scriptures are actually quite clear on this. There are some things that admittedly we wrestle with because there's maybe not all that much said. But when it comes to the leadership in the Lord's church, there's quite a bit said about these offices or these positions, appointments, and what they're to be and to look like and what the qualifiers are, the characteristics, and so forth. And so when we come to a deacon, it's similar in a lot of ways to the eldership in that in the same text where Paul writes to Timothy and gives the characteristics of an elder, he also gives the characteristics of a deacon right there, just as Al read for us a moment ago. But I think it's also noteworthy to recognize that this is not just something Paul mentioned there as he wrote to Timothy. But for instance, in Philippians chapter 1, when Paul and Timothy are writing together, as it's shown to us, it says Paul and Timothy in verse 1, bondservants of Jesus Christ. And then he lists who's involved in the church at Philippi. He says, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi, with the bishops and deacons, or with the overseers, or with the elders. That bishop term, as we talked about, the elder term, there's several terms that are used for the same office. But deacons are specifically mentioned here in that introduction to this letter to a church. And that gives a lot of strength to understanding this office or this appointed position of a deacon. And so then again in 1 Timothy chapter 3, where you have the qualifications or the characteristics, it's very similarly outlined as it is with the elders. If you remember, we talked about with elders, there were some things that were the must-be components, and that's exactly how he starts talking about it in 1 Timothy 3, verse 8, when he says, likewise, deacons must be, and then here he gives several qualifications or characteristics that must be met. One of the great controversies that has come up through the years in regard to deacons is, can women be deacons? Anybody ever heard that? Okay, I want to address that somewhat today. But the key in understanding that, I believe, is not to debate a particular person, which is what often comes up, and I'll allude to that in a moment, in the Scripture. But it's actually to understand the title itself and the term that's being used. And that's really the case even with elder. We talked quite a bit about the various terms because that's where a lot of the confusion comes in, because different churches, different denominations, different religious groups have used different terms through the years, and it creates confusion. Well, understanding the title or the term is really important when it comes to deacon. The word deacon is a transliteration. In other words, the English didn't have a word for it, and so in order to have a word, they basically tried to create a word from the original, okay, from the Greek. And the Greek word was diakonos, which means one who executes the commands of another, or especially the commands of a master, and it was most often used in terms of the type of service that what we would call in our culture that of a waiter. Okay, so when you think of going to a restaurant and you expect that you will have a waiter or a waitress, and when you refer to what the waiter or the waitress does in that restaurant, when you say at the end of the night, if you say it was good or it was bad, you will tie another term with that without even thinking. You'll say, well, it was good service or it was bad service. All right, well, that in a nutshell ties up the real meaning of this word. This is a waiter that performs a service. Okay? That's the idea of the original term. And every time it's used, and by the way, it's used more than 20 times in the New Testament text. And it's always referring to this idea of service. And so often it is translated as servant or minister instead of being translated deacon. The term deacon is, again, a term that was really created because there was a recognition that in certain places, like in Philippians 1 and like in 1 Timothy 3, that Paul is giving not only a term as a meaning, but he was giving it an appointment, okay, a title, an office in the church. And so instead of, the text simply could read, as we would bring it to English, likewise servants must be reverent. Or likewise, ministers must be reverent. But see, that creates some confusion. And so, if they put in there, likewise, diakoni must be, reverent, then that would be confusing to us too, because we're like, well, what is that? So, there's really, deacon is a created title term, but it's all tied to this word that means a waiter giving service. Okay, a servant. All right, not a bond servant, not a slave, but a waiter giving service. Just to give you some picture of that, there are some, and I'm going to be pretty generic about this, just because I really don't like calling names out in the pulpit unless you just have to. But there are some religious groups that the deacon in the church will wear a towel of some kind across their shoulder or whatever as part of their kind of clergy apparel, if you will, and that has its roots all the way back in this original term that is so closely tied to waiter. Somebody who would literally be waiting on at the service of those that would be in an assembly, in a room, at a table, whatever it might be. And so I just want to create that word picture because that helps understand the entire thing so much more when we know that. And so as I mentioned, it's translated in the New Testament as at least these three different things: minister, servant, and deacon. And so in a generic sense, it has this servant meaning. But in a technical and a very pointed sense, there's this specific work that is to be done in the church. Like elders, we see some specific positive qualifications. They must have or must be these things. First is reverent. And this has the idea of being grave or serious, men of dignity, sober-minded. You can think of it in that way. Now, I think that the general thought is often that, well, the elders are older and the deacons can be younger. And so you can kind of think of this in terms of you can't have, a young man who's just a goofball, serving as a deacon in the church. Well, there might be some merit to that in this idea, but a reverence. Well, this is also important. Again, I'm going to take it back to thinking about the service you receive when you go to a restaurant. You want a certain kind of dignity from the person waiting on you. If they just came up and plopped their pad down on your table and said, "Hey, what do you want?" Then you'd be kind of like, "Excuse me?" Like, what is going on here? You expect a certain decorum and a certain dignity in that. There's also the statement of holding the mystery of the faith with a pure conscience. In other words, they're firm believers. They are men that are faithful. They are true believers. They're not wishy-washy. They're not here or there or wandering or of question in that way. There's a certain blamelessness to that. Kind of the idea, and we'll see this as we keep going further, that really nobody could question they are a Christian and that they are in the church. Nobody could question that in that regard. They're to be tested or proven. Okay, they're to be tested. So, what does this mean? Well, I wish Paul had given a greater explanation of it. But I think we can at least deduct from this that there should have been some amount of time in which they've been a part of the congregation and been a part of the local church, and that they have been involved in various service and work within the church to where you know what you're getting. You know that, okay, if I give them a task, they can do it. If I give them an assignment, they can carry it through. And that is the thing that is known. And that would be that testing and being able to be proven. And that's just Lance kind of putting that into terms because we don't really have a specific example. But I think that makes sense, that there's a testing there. Which it's, again, if you were going to think about it in restaurant terms, you might have had a situation where you go to a restaurant and instead of one waiter, you've got two waiters. And why might that be? One of them's training, right? You ever had that? Well, I'm training today, so I'm shadowing whoever it is. And so there's that testing period, if you will, where they're learning alongside someone else in that way. So we can wrap our mind around what it means to have a testing time or transition, etc., etc. They're to be husbands of one wife. Exact same thing that was said of the elders. A very literal translation of this would be that they're to be one woman man. Okay? I heard a guy talking about this, gave a really great explanation of this. And I wish I had used this in talking about elders. I don't think I did. But, he said, well, why would that even matter or be important aside from this idea of eliminating, polygamy and eliminating major questions about multiple marriages even or something like that? Why would it even matter? Well, think about this. If you're, even in Acts chapter 6, and we'll talk more about this in a moment, but in Acts 6, when those men were selected to see to the feeding of the widows, all right, you're talking about men going into the homes of single women. Now think about it. That man needs to be trustworthy, doesn't he? That man needs to be trusted by multiple people. He's got to be trusted by his wife, if he's going to be out doing this work among other women. He's got to be trusted by the women that he is waiting on and serving and helping. And he's got to be trusted by the elders, by the apostles in the case of Acts 6. And so there's a trust there. And you think about this, we know this among men and women alike. If somebody is a flirt, if somebody is just kind of loose in the way that they act and their attitude toward the opposite sex, then you can just sense when there's maybe not a high level of trust there with that man. And whether you'd have a high level of trust if he's going to be serving among women in particular. But in the Lord's church, there's no way around that. In the Lord's church, you're going to be serving not only your fellow man, but you're going to be serving women, fellow women, sisters in the faith as well. And so you think about it, this one-woman man idea, what it really would mean to the ones that it matters the most to that widow or to that single mother or to any woman in the congregation, is that when that man walks in, you trust him because you know how committed and faithful he is to his wife. And you know how much she trusts him. And you know how much the elders trust him and his wife. And there's that rapport that has been built and has been seen and has been characterized to where you can trust them to come into your home to serve and to help you. That you can trust them to be in among the assembly of the saints, men or women, either one, and them be trusted. Whereas I think we all have known those who, again, have been, I'll just use the term a flirt, somebody that's been a flirt with all the women kind of thing. And that might be the very person that you would say, well, I don't want them going to my mother's home alone kind of deal. And it's a shame to have to even say anything like that, but that's a reality, guys. And so when you look at these qualifiers that are given here for deacons and for elders for that matter, that becomes a very practical thing we can see when you just stop and think about it for a while. Why does it matter that these men are one-woman men? Because they need to be trusted. They need to be trusted. In among men and women alike in service in the church. The statement is made in verse 12 that they're to be ruling their children and their house well. Again, almost identical to the statement about elders. Okay, that they are to rule well in that regard. One comment that I'll make about this that I don't know that we touched on unless we did Sunday afternoon. There's a lot of debate about children because it's a plural term that is used here. And does that mean that elders and deacons have to have multiple children? That's going to be the most conservative interpretation of that. And I'll say I don't have a problem with understanding things that way. It says plural. Probably the best thing is for an elder or a deacon to have plural children. But we also have to understand that grammar doesn't necessarily work that way. For instance, if I'm addressing a room of 100 men and the question on the table is, can I serve as an elder in the Lord's church? And I'm going to talk to you about your offspring. I'm going to use an obviously different term here. If I'm going to talk to everybody in the room about their offspring, what I would not say is that you have to have a faithful child and rule your own house well. I wouldn't say that because grammatically, to cover the whole thing, what I would say is you must have faithful children. It covers the whole thing grammatically. I don't have to specify child or 2 children or 3 children or whatever. Now, does that mean that just wipes out the whole idea of the plurality? I don't know that. I'm just saying word of caution against somebody who really pounds the podium and says they have to have multiple children. Well, grammatically, that doesn't necessarily fit. Okay? Because that could have been used plural that way just because he's covering the whole idea of the deal. Okay? So, you say, well, Lance, what do we do with that? Well, I'll tell you what we do with that. We do what we'd have to do with all of this. And that is that as a local assembly of God's people, this is a work that we've got to come to a consensus and do anyway. In other words, and I'll talk more about this in a moment, but elders are not self-appointed, as in I'm qualified and I will now serve and I'm the final say on the deal with my children and everything else. No. Their appointment comes along with, really, in essence, the agreement of the congregation or the understanding of the congregation, specifically with elders, with the other elders if they are in place, or with the minister, the preacher, that has helped bring that qualification about. With the deacons, it seems they are to be really kind of put forth and selected by the congregation. That's what happens in Acts chapter 6, and I see no reason to really vary from that. Now, obviously, if you've got elders in place, are they going to help be a part of bringing along deacons? Sure, for sure. But the point is that it is among us that we got to figure this out. Are we going to select somebody to potentially be a deacon and then outsource it to some other professional Church of Christ center to say, now verify these guys and make sure they're qualified? No, we're not going to do that. No, it's to be done locally among this congregation. Okay, so these are the positive things. There are some specific negative qualifiers here for deacons as well. Not to be double-tongued. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're not liars. They're not deceivers. They're not saying one thing and then doing another. They're not saying one thing here and another thing when they're over there. They're not different outside of the assembly of the saints in that way, okay? They're not double-tongued, okay? They're who they are. They're faithful to that, okay? And that's an important thing. Sometimes we really struggle with that as men. We got to be super cool and just like everybody at work kind of thing. And then we'll come to church and we kind of put our good boy britches on and try to behave, you know. Well, this is really kind of saying, no, you're not double-tongued. You are the same outside of the assembly as you are inside the assembly. Not given to much wine. Same statement as ultimately given to the elders. This is an issue really that I would say is more of that day and that culture than it really should be today. And not to get on a whole different subject too much, but wine was the main beverage. Okay? If you had constantly clean drinking water, in many cases that would have been seen as a high privilege. You just didn't necessarily have that. And so having stored wine was a really common thing. Well, the deal was if you stored wine, it fermented, you know. And so then they would dilute it with water, okay, to make it go further and to make it not be as intoxicating and all that. But in other words, this was something they had to deal with, okay? They had to deal with this, all right? I'll tell you what I think of it, and I can't help but think this now that we've had all these kids back to back to back. But you pregnant ladies can relate to this. But, you know, they don't want you to have but so much caffeine, right? You know? And so that becomes something that through a pregnancy you have to manage that. If you've been somebody who's used to drinking 2 cups of coffee every day, then now like things have to change kind of deal so that you change that level of caffeine that you're going to have. Well, we're not shocked by something like that with a pregnancy because it's like, well, we got to do what's right for the baby and we got to deal with that and just work with that. Well, that would have been, I think, really largely how they saw the situation with wine. Is that, okay, it's here, and this is one of our main drinks. We just have to deal with it and watch it and make sure it doesn't become so strong. And that's the way the Old Testament Scriptures talk about it, as a strong drink. You knew what you were getting into if it was strong. And so they had to make sure it was not so strong as to intoxicate, as to alter the mind. Now, the other thing about that I'll say, and I'll move on, is that even what would become a strong drink in that day and time and become intoxicating in that day and time pales in comparison to the alcoholic content that's in the beverages that are made and produced today. Okay? And so when some people want to argue and say, well, it's okay for me to, drink because it says, well, not given to much wine, and I would say, look, you don't even know what ball game you're inside of, because that's a whole different ball game. Now, the reality is we have so many choices today, I think it's pretty inexcusable for Christians to ever be in a situation where they might be on the verge of getting drunk. Now, am I saying you can't drink anything that ever has alcohol? I'm not saying that. That's not what the Scripture says. I don't have the authority to say that. But what I am saying is we don't deal with it. We don't have to deal with it the way that they deal with it. It'd be like if we walked up to a soda machine and, 7 out of 8 things had alcohol in it. And we had to decide, well, how much of this am I going to mix with water versus whatever? Guys, that's not what we deal with. We have so many choices that it is a different kind of choice in dealing with. So it's not comparing the same thing when people try to argue about that thing today. That's what I want you to see. So this is an evidence for an elder and a deacon of their self-control, of their awareness, of their commitment to sobriety and to doing things in a smart way. It's all of those things, okay? But it's also not. Let's not make it what it's not, I guess is what I'm saying too. And the last one on here is not greedy for money, and this is important too. Hey, what do you do for the waiter or waitress when you go to a restaurant? You give them a tip, right? I mean, you don't think that was probably happening even among the Lord's church in the early days? When somebody would be serving and helping the widows and all these, and somebody said, look, let me help you out for your trouble and at least pay for this or that or whatever. I mean, I'm sure things like that were happening. And so if you were a man who was greedy for money, then you could almost see, you see an opportunity there, right? And now I can make a lot of tips by doing this service for the church, kind of thing. And so not greedy for money, I think, will be a big deal potentially in the role of a deacon if they're really doing what the deacon is to do and being a servant among the church. They're to be trusted in that way. And even when you go to the extent of the treasury of the church, if the elders are going to say, here's a task, and it needs to be taken care of, and it's going to take some money, obviously, to do it, they got to be trusted with that. So that they're not the keeper of the money or the taker of the money and doing things in a way that wouldn't be right. Well, I want to talk more about this in practical terms and in understanding why this office matters so much. For one, it's generally supposed that they were servants to assist the elders in physical matters, okay? Practical matters. But I will also hedge that a little bit to say there's nothing that specifically says a deacon is the servant of the elders. No, in contrast to that, the deacon is put as a servant of the church. I've already said that several times. But if you pay attention to the details of it, they're not servants of the elders. They're servants of the church. Okay? And so they're to serve in tasks among the church that benefits the church, not just things that benefit the elders. In other words, it doesn't seem that the intent of this was for somebody to become Mike's assistant, kind of thing. All right? Or for somebody to be doing something just for the elders in that way. It seems to be, no, these are things that, the elders want to do and oversee, but they've only got so much time, only got so much, only so many hands and arms and legs and all that kind of thing, and so they need to be able to send somebody to tend to this kind of thing. In the example in Acts chapter 6, when the apostles had the congregation select the men that they were going to appoint to the work of servicing the widows, they specifically said it wouldn't be right for them to leave the work of ministering the word and prayer. They needed to be spending time praying with the people and teaching the Word of God to people. And if they were going to have to cut into that time in order to serve food to the widows, they said that wouldn't be appropriate. And so that's why they needed these extra hands to go and do that very thing. Okay, so notice that. They were going to go do that thing there in Acts 6. That was not to serve the elders. They were actually appointed by the elders to a task to serve the church. And that's an important difference to see. Okay? Sometimes we could get that upside down, and what would end up happening is that deacons begin really doing the work the elders should be doing. And there is a difference there, if that makes sense. Just like, and we'll talk about this, Lord willing, in another week or so, sometimes everybody seems to think the preacher is supposed to do these certain things, and then upon closer examination, that's what the elders are supposed to do. And so sometimes preachers can become servants of the elders when, no, actually preachers, evangelists, and deacons are to be servants of the church. And that's a different kind of thing. And they're doing that with the elders, okay? It's a joint effort in that way, but it's different than just serving specifically the elders. B.W. Johnson said their office seemed to have been to look after the temporal matters of the church and especially to care for the poor and the widows. Barnes says in his commentary, the word here evidently denotes those who had charge of the temporal affairs of the church, the poor, etc. Notice the charge idea. In other words, they were responsible for it. It's another thing where if somebody doesn't have the responsibility for it, it'll go undone or it'll become a mess. In the book of Exodus, if you remember, there comes a point in time when Moses is having all the people come to him all the time. And he's sitting from morning until night, judging the people and judging all their questions and all this stuff. And his father-in-law comes to him, and his father-in-law says, Moses, I want to tell you how you need to do this. and he tells him, select men and have the people help you select men, and some to be over thousands, and some over hundreds, and some over tens, and let them judge in the small matters, and let the hard matters be brought to you. And Moses is like, hey, that's a good idea, right? So ultimately, that's what becomes part of the process in that time. But what it shows more than anything else is that one man can only do so much. A couple of men can only do so much. And so you get to a place where you do need additional servants. You do need additional workers doing these things. The character, the qualifications makes it clear that they were to be appointed as dispensers of alms who should come in close personal relations with the poor. That's from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. I wanted to hone in on that term, dispensers. How you like that, deacons? You'd be called a dispenser, But that really is kind of the picture here, that they have a task, there's a specific kind of service, and they need to dispense that service. They need to take care of it and see to it that it happens in that way. In Acts chapter 6, I've referenced this a couple of times. If you will turn with me there, I want to read this just briefly, part of it. This seems to be where the office of deacon really has its beginning. And it's not with elders, but it's with the apostles as the overseers of the church in Jerusalem, the early church. And so it says in Acts 6, beginning in verse 1, now in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists because their widows were neglected in the daily distribution. Then the 12 summoned the multitude of the disciples and said, it is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Therefore, brethren, seek out from among you 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the Word. All right, so you notice there's a problem brought up among the congregation, among all the disciples, as it's talked about there. All right, and the problem is that there are widows that are not native to Jerusalem. Okay, the Hellenists. So remember, on the day of Pentecost, you would have had Jews that had come from all over and been there on that day. And so you had people who had become Christians, and they had stayed together there in Jerusalem, which was much of the reason for the need for them to sell things and share money and all this stuff, because some of these people just decided, hey, we're going to stay here and worship together with the Christians because we've become Christians now here in this place. Well, among that group, very apparently, there's a large amount of widows, both of the local people, native to the Jerusalem area, and of those that had migrated in from outside. Well, you can see how it could kind of get a little bit difficult to even manage that, right? For instance, what if, in this scenario, what if 2 widows in all this had met each other, and one had said, hey, listen, I got room, come stay at my house. And so this widow from out of town is staying at the house of this widow that's local, and the elders or whoever show up with some daily distribution of things, and they got food for how many? For one. Why they got food for one? Well, we knew so-and-so was living here. We didn't know. And you see how you can get a mess on your hands real quick, right? And then the complaint goes around, because you women, y'all spread stuff. No, I'm just making sure you're listening. But no, I mean, the complaint then goes around that, hey, people are getting overlooked, You're not accounting for these people who have moved in. And that's where you can see where then the apostle will be like, well, all right, now that's going to take some serious work here. I mean, I don't know how many widows it was, but you had 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. The disciples' number is growing through these first few chapters. I mean, what if they had 300 widows? Well, that's a pretty big undertaking to kind of get around to and figure out day to day or week to week or whatever it was. So anyway, all that to say, you can see how this could be a real problem and take some time, and then you can maybe understand why the apostles say, look guys, our charge from Jesus was to preach the Word. Not to serve tables as they talk about it here. And note that serving of tables type reference is specifically this diakonos type deal of waiting on in a specific service to in that way. And so, it wasn't a small thing. It wasn't that it was beneath who had been overseeing the work so far and probably helping do it. I would guess it was the apostles. But they had to call it at some point and say, look, we can't, this is going to take way too much time. And so it wasn't that it was beneath them. That's another thing that happens sometimes, is we think that deacons are beneath the elders. They do the things that are beneath the elders. No, it's just a different thing. Okay? It's just a different thing. And so they're going to be appointed to this work differently. And so they choose 7 men. Now I want to note something here, and I'm going to hurry because we're running out of time. But I want to note something about what happens here that I think tells us something about the women question. Can women be deacons? First, note that it was a limited number. They knew the scope of the work, and in this case they said, select from among the congregation 7 men. Okay? So what I could even surmise from that is, I don't know that we need an unlimited amount of deacons. It's not just an office to stick a name on kind of thing. Okay? No, it's in conjunction with the work that's to be done. If you've got work to be done, then you need a certain amount of hands to do it. And so there was a specific number given here. I think that's important. Because think about what's not said, as I often say. They could have said, select from among you as many men as you can find, that fit this. No, they had a number in mind. They said 7, which we could get on to another thing there. That's a significant kind of number among the Jews. They were selected, again, not just by the apostles. The apostles didn't say, we want these 7 men. That's not what they said. They said, you as a congregation of disciples, you select from among yourselves 7 men. So ultimately they're seeking a consensus. They're seeking that everybody knows these men meet these qualifications and everybody trusts these men to do this work. And so they all can be brought forward in that way. They were men. I've said that several times. This would have been an opportune time for the apostles to have said, select from among yourselves 4 women and 4 men kind of thing. But they did not. And I know the feminist side of things won't like that, but it is what it is. Don't get mad at me. It's what's right there. Notice again what he did not say. He did not specify women, but he did specify men. Okay? And this, again, most scholars are going to agree, this is the prototype, if you will, of the office of deacon. And it follows then with what's said later, because that's what's said in the text in 1 Timothy 3:8. He says, the deacons likewise husband. Oh, is he specifying men? Yeah, husband of one wife. And so why would he specify men? Well, they specified men in Acts 6. So it really shouldn't be shocking in that way. They had a charge. They had a responsibility. Hey, guess what? To my knowledge, I don't think I overlooked it or missed it. We don't hear anything about the widows needing food through the rest of the book of Acts. They were given that task and that responsibility, and all evidence points to the fact they took care of it. They took care of it from then on out. And the task, I want to say this one with some hesitation, but in this case anyway, the task was singular. They had one job. Sometimes we think that deacons are just do-alls and they just do whatever, kind of thing. And I would caution us against that because, again, this first example, think about this. If another issue had been brought to the apostles, would they have piled it on the same 7 men? Maybe. But if you just follow the specific example, I'm kind of inclined to think that if another issue had been brought to them, they would have said, select from you 3 more men, and we will appoint them to this matter. That's kind of the way the example seems to go. That the tasks were appointed to these men. Hey, was it going to be enough for those 7 men to see to that work day in and that seems to be pretty evident. That was going to be enough for them to have to do. That's why would they say 7? Because that's what it was going to take. I wish I knew the details. Maybe they chose 7 and the deal was, each of you get 1 day of the week. I don't, that would have made some sense. But whatever it was, they were appointed a singular task in this case, which again at least leads me to think maybe if another issue had been brought before the apostles, they would have said, now select someone else for that task. And let's do it. And so you'll see some congregations that will really get specific about what their elders do. What their deacons do in that way. Well, when should a deacon be appointed? Well, similar to the elders, I would say when he is willing. 1 Timothy 3 seems to indicate this is a position, this is an office that is to be taken and held because of that willingness. In verse 13 of 1 Timothy 3, for those who have served well as deacons, obtain for themselves a good standing and great boldness in the faith which is in Christ Jesus. There's a willingness to serve. That's what they're going to be doing. When he's qualified, there are the qualifiers in 8 through 13. Meeting that testing even is part of that in that way. And then I would also say, not only the testing, but in looking at the Acts 6 example, if we can draw something from that we could emulate today that makes a lot of sense, it's when a task or a service needs attention. If the elders, if the congregation sees that there is a service that needs to be rendered among the saints, then who is it in the Scriptures that we see are the examples of those that would render such service? It's the deacons. It's the deacons. The ministry of the Word and of prayer and of the spiritual things in particular, the onus is certainly on the elders for that. But when it comes to physical needs and such, material type things, then it seems to be that the charge is with the deacons among the saints. In Romans 16, in verse 1, you'll find the verse that brings up controversy, where Paul said, I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a diakoni of the church in Cenchrea. It is the word. The same word that's used for deacon is right there talking about Phoebe. But here's the thing to note. I mentioned that it's more than 20 times that word is used in the New Testament, and there's only 2 or 3 times that it specifies the office or the position of a deacon in the church. And those times are when Paul writes it to Timothy, when Paul writes it to Titus, and then in Acts chapter 6, even though there's not an office talked about, it's there in that text where they are selecting men to do that. And so every other time it's rendered like the New King James does here when it says, who is a servant. It uses the basic term, a servant. So what do we take from that? Well, here's what I would take from that. Again, the qualifiers and the example in Acts 6 specify men. It would have been super easy for God, through the Spirit, to inspire these writers and to give us an example and a teaching that also included women, clearly. In the context of Paul's writing to Timothy, he also, just prior to this, specifically says that he does not permit a woman to have authority over a man or to teach over a man. And so, again, don't hate me for it, but it is what it is in the design that's given and the structure that's given, that the men were to take the leadership roles in the church. Now, the thing that's noteworthy about this is that Phoebe could still be commended by Paul in writing, and that she could be commended as a servant of the church in Cenchrea. So women were still able to be recognized in their service in the church. But as far as a certain title or being recognized in that leadership appointment type role, they simply are not. The other question about this sometimes comes up in 1 Timothy 3, where when it says in verse 11, likewise their wives must be reverent. Where it says their wives, the term specifically there is women. And so some have argued and said, well, this is a subset where he is saying likewise women in other words, women who are deacons, women who are serving, must be these things. Well, the problem with that is it doesn't flow with the context. Because in the context, he talks about the elders and their role and their qualifiers. He talks about the deacons and their role and their qualifiers. And he adds with that the wives or the women in association with those men. It doesn't seem to be a separated thing at all in that way. Have I confused everybody? I hope not. Deacons are certainly an important part of the work of the Lord's church. Daily distribution, serving tables, the business that was referred to there in Acts chapter 6. I think all of those things make a lot of sense in understanding what we should recognize is the appointment of the deacons. Lord willing, next week we will talk about evangelists, if I have the courage to. If I have the courage to. If you're not a Christian this morning, what's holding you back? You know, the reality is each of us should be willing to be servants of God, right? Deacons are certainly special servants in the work of the Lord's church. Elders are certainly special servants in the work of the Lord's church. But each of us need to examine ourselves and think about what service we have brought, to the Lord and to the congregation, to one another in that way. Can we be relied on? I think that's one of the things that's eye-opening about these qualifications, if you will, and the characteristics that you see as you begin to question if you turn your brain on it all, you just kind of have the natural question of, well, do I even rise up to any of those things? I mean, really and truly, with the elders and with the deacons, all of us should be trying to rise up to meet those kind of characteristics. And so what's holding us back? What's holding us back from being true servants of the Lord, faithful servants, trusted servants, and those that are recognized among one another inside the assembly, in the congregation, as those that are serving one another as we serve God? That's what we need to do. If you're not a faithful Christian, we'd ask you to come while we stand and sing, and we'll pray with you and for you. If you're not a Christian, become one. Jesus said, "He that believes and is baptized shall be saved." We can baptize you right here today, if that's what you desire. Whatever we can do to help, won't you come while we stand and sing?